He promised you order. He promised you peace. And all he demanded in return was your silent, obedient consent. Last night I sought to end that silence. Last night I destroyed the Old Bailey to remind this country of what it has forgotten. More than 400 years ago, a great citizen wished to embed the 5th of November forever in our memory. His hope was to remind the world that fairness, justice, and freedom are more than words. They are perspectives. So if you see nothing, if the crimes of this government remain unknown to you, then I would suggest that you allow the 5th of November to pass unmarked. But if you see what I see, if you feel as I feel, and if you would seek as I seek, then I ask you to stand beside me 1 year from tonight, outside the gates of Parliament, and together we shall give them a 5th of November that shall never, ever be forgot. But anyway, that's that particular speech. So that's that out of the way. So I really should get on with your questions. So here we go. Question 1. Similarly to communism, the biggest flaw I can see is its advocating an idealized end state without there being a practical transition mechanism. Saying everyone everywhere has to change to a different fundamental system and way of life is the best way to guarantee conflict and the impossibility of the end goal. Okay, well, I'll break your question down to the separate points so I can address everything. First off, to compare an RBE to communism or any other previously existing system is going to seriously taint and impede your understanding of it. It's like trying to compare chalk and cheese. You know, an RBE is unlike any system that humankind has ever known. As such, we need to judge it on its own merits, not judge it by anything that has existed before. I can understand the compulsion to compare. It's rife in our culture to do things like that. And it's far easier to compare things because it's a way of gauging a frame of reference. You know, I completely understand that. However, we need to realize how detrimental such a practice is to our intellectual, emotional, and social development. For instance, consider the level of cultural bias we have towards things that are outside of our current methods and values. They're immediately demonized. And of course, it's easy to slip from one prima facie association to the other. It's easy to go from, this sounds like communism, to, you're going to start slaughtering people just like Stalin did. But anyway, on to your next point. There is no idealized end state because there's no such thing. I've explained that fully in my Dispelling Myths podcast when I speak on the topic of the word utopia. Next, how can the process of transition from a monetary system to a non-monetary system, something that has never occurred in human history, have a practical transition mechanism, as you call it? You know, how can anything be planned ahead of time? None of us are prophets, but anyway, I won't harp on this point because I've addressed it a few times before in my previous podcast. So if you want to know my stance on it, go have a listen to my previous ones. But on to your last point, you say that everywhere has to change to a different fundamental system and way of life. This actually isn't the case. You're assuming that an RBE isn't a mandatory system, that it is a mandatory system, but it isn't a mandatory system. I grant you that an RBE won't immediately be for everyone. There will be certain people whose capitalist conditioning is just so damn strong that they cannot exist without having a monetary system. As such, individuals like that are free to go build their own monetary systems after the collapse if they want to. Not that the very collapse of the global monetary paradigm was enough to teach them that such a system is inherently unsustainable by its very operant logic, but hell, some people will be like that. You see, an RBE is a system where people will come and go as they please. It's not a mandatory thing at all. Like what Peter Joseph said in his Z-Day presentation this year, when addressing the issue of whether people did or didn't want to live in an RBE, and in the context of whether people don't want to live in it, he just simply said, well then don't. Now, I can understand the confusion here, since everything we've come to know in our current system is seemingly mandatory. As far as we're taught about the society we live in right now, we have to go to school, we have to get a job, we have to fill out the census form, we have to pay our taxes, etc. But we're so used to being ordered around that we can't even conceive of a world where we wouldn't be ordered around. So I can understand why such questions come up. When people ask me, but I want to be able to do my own thing, is there going to be someone stopping me if I don't do things the way everyone else does things? What's going to happen if I want to travel outside the city? Well, like I said, mandatory considerations are so ingrained in our established societal models that they trickle down into our culture and our psychology. As such, we ask questions about things already with the assumption that mandatory constraints are always going to be upon us. But, anyway, question 2. What will happen for people who choose to step out of line? I read somewhere that they will be re-educated. This sounds extremely negative to me and reminds me of the re-education camps. What methods of re-education will be used? Okay, this is a rather sticky topic when it comes to TZM, mainly due to the charged nature of such a phrase. The phrase being re-education. However, I'll tell you what, I'll try my best to present it in a way that will reassure you that it isn't shady or oppressive at all. For decades, the term re-education has always been synonymous with the re-education camps, as you have put it. However, this is nothing to do with what is involved here. When you think about the process of learning, be it formative or otherwise, you realize that everything is a process of re-education. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the term re-education may not even exist in the actual context that we're talking about here. I mean, either everything is a process of re-education, or everything is simply a case of education. When a child goes to school and learns something new, that can be classed as a process of re-education. Because before the class they have a certain data set on a given topic, and they come out with either a different data set or an updated and or improved one. Maybe the phrasing either way is down to the individual themselves. I personally choose to use the term education, because it doesn't imply any kind of forced assimilation of knowledge. Now, in the context of your question here, it will depend on the individual involved, what they may have done, and whether or not said individual really wants to remain in an RBE. You see, this question only applies to certain possible situations during the time that humanity is settling in to the RBE way of life. Once society comes to terms with what can be done with the state of technology, how things can work, what can be possible, there will be a significantly lower rate of disagreement and or dysfunction, if that. But as for your question, it is important to outline how disturbances of function in this manner will be dealt with. For example, if a certain individual is contributing to the technical processes of a geothermal plant, say, and they find themselves in the situation that they are valuing their ideas as more superior to others, despite that the ideas they have contributed may not be optimal and they feel their ideas should be incorporated, then obviously said individual would need to be taken to one side and talked to about the situation. The first and one of the most important things to ascertain, however, is to find out why and how this dysfunction has manifested to begin with. To get to the root of the problem first, because only when we have knowledge of the root causality will we stand a chance of solving it properly and amicably. Also because I dare say that a fair few situations can be resolved with peaceful understanding and compromise. Depending on the depth and strength of their value distortion, they might agree that they need to accept that ideas come and go and some aren't as optimal as others. So it's best to just get over it and go with what works best. But of course this has to be tempered with a consideration of the person's ideas on their own merit. It may be the case that their idea is in fact optimal, but they've not presented it clearly enough, maybe. In said scenario, they will be helped with how to present ideas better. But say they can't accept that. Say that, their idea isn't optimal and they can't accept that. In such an instant, they would have to agree to go and learn more of why things are done the way they're done. I mean, no one is forced to do anything. They are shown what options are there, what can be done, and they're encouraged to arrive at their own choices. In the most extreme case, that is that it, say for example, it's clear that they present a danger to either themselves or others, then they will be taken or sent or escorted, or however you wish to phrase it, without the implication of maybe banished or imprisoned or incarcerated. Just, get those colourful semantic traps out of the way. But they will be invited to an environment where the root causes of their dysfunction will need deeper examination, and a solution will be sought through compassion, consideration and education. Now, such a place could be termed rehabilitation/education facility. However, as you can tell, it is difficult to describe this process without it sounding like we're going to lock up anyone who doesn't agree with us in some kind of nut house and recreate, a Clockwork Orange for all the inmates. Obviously that isn't the case. Now, I can tell this may in some sense seem oppressive or elitist. However, the larger order of function and harmony needs to be taken into account. If there is an individual who poses a threat to the safety of themselves or others, or a threat to the functioning of the system as a whole, then something needs to be done. Now, as I said earlier, said individual might not want to live in an RBE because their values may or may not be in line. In said situation, they will be free to leave. However, if they do wish to live in an RBE, they must agree to learn why things are done the way they are, as we must also learn why they feel the way they do. Anyway, question 3. Is this the homogenization of the planet? If I understand your definition correctly, then essentially what you're asking is whether an RBE is a process of the encouraged uniformity of all things. I would state that this is not the case. In an RBE, individuality and freedom is essential and in fact preferred. As such, human life, and not to mention any other form of life on the planet, must be allowed to progress without any attempt to manipulate it. For example, no human being will be forced to conform to anything. It is in all of our best interests that a human being is free and autonomous so that they can express themselves in the most optimal manner possible. Take, for instance, how a restrictive environment such as prison can degrade and even destroy the quote-unquote spirit of a person. An RBE wishes to do the opposite of that. Granted, there will be uniform considerations in values examples of this would be that everyone will be the same in the respect that they will all hopefully consider the acts of violence